Welcome to Boxing Revival. In this video, I have ranked the best boxers of the 1980s. The 1980s was filled with important fights, events, and fighters that shaped the legacy of the sport. With the retirement of Muhammad Ali, the sport needed a new boxing hero to count on. Don King continues to be the top promoter, with Bob Arum and Murad Muhammad emerging in the promoting scene. This decade is remembered for the rivalry and the great battles of the Fabulous Four. With Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran, and Tommy Hearns fighting each other throughout the decade, with Wilfred Benitez also emerging in that rivalry. I have also listed down the honorable mentions of the 1980s. The boxers who have great careers in the decade, but just misses the top 10 rankings. This rankings is purely based on their performance and career achievements in the decade. So let's take a look where this boxers rank in the best of the 1980s. At number 10. Salvador Chava Sanchez. The Mexican legend was one of the greatest featherweight of all time. He defended his WBC and lineal featherweight titles 9 times, from 1980 until his premature death in 1982 at the age of 23, when he died from car accident. Sanchez could have been the greatest featherweight of all time. In a short career, he holds wins over Azuma Nelson and giving Wilfredo Gomez the first loss of his career. At number 9. Evander, the Real Deal, Holyfield. Before reigning as one of the best heavyweights in the 1990s, Holyfield was the king of the cruiserweight division in the latter part of the 1980s. He won the bronze medal in the light heavyweight division of the 1984 Olympic Games. Holyfield won the WBA cruiserweight title in 1986. Adding the IBF title in 1987 and the WBC title in 1988 to reign as the undisputed cruiserweight champion. Holyfield was one of the greatest cruiserweights of all time. At number 8. The Hands of Stone, Roberto Duran. Duran was part of the legendary Fab Four. Although he suffered 7 losses in the 1980s, he won 3 of his 4 titles in this decade. He beat Sugar Ray Leonard for the welterweight title in 1980. He also won the WBA super welterweight title in 1983 and the WBC middleweight title in 1989 with a win over Yvonne Barkley. Although Duran was great in 1980s, his best years was in the 1970s. He was one of the greatest boxers of all time. At number 7. The Easton Assassin, Larry Holmes. The American great was one of the best heavyweights of all time. His left jab was one of the best punch in boxing. He held the WBC heavyweight title from 1978 and added the lineal and the ring heavyweight titles in 1980, holding the crown until 1985. During his reign, Larry Holmes defended his title against 19 different boxers, including Muhammad Ali, giving Ali the first stoppage loss of his career. At number 6. The great Mexican champion, Julio Cesar Chavez. Chavez was a 3-division champion in the decade, reigning as the WBC super featherweight champion from 1984 to 1987. The WBA, WBC, the ring, and lineal lightweight champion between 1987 to 1988. And won the WBC light welterweight title in 1989 with a win over Roger Mayweather. Chavez was voted as the 1987 Boxing Writers of America Fighter of the Year. He was considered as one of the greatest Mexican boxers of all time. At number 5. Michael Spinks. The American boxer was a two-division champion in the decade. He won the WBA light heavyweight title in 1981, added the WBC and the ring titles in 1983, to reign as the undisputed champion until 1985. In 1985 and 1986, he gave Larry Holmes the first two losses of his career, to claim the lineal heavyweight title, defending it until 1988, when he was defeated by Mike Tyson, the only loss of his stellar career. At number 4. Iron Mike Tyson. Known as the baddest man on the planet, Tyson was the youngest boxer to win the heavyweight title, when he defeated Trevor Berbick for the WBC heavyweight title in 1986, at only 20 years old. He added the WBA and IBF titles in 1987, to become the undisputed heavyweight champion until 1990. He defeated former champions Larry Holmes and Michael Spinks both by a knockout. Mike Tyson in his prime was one of the most intimidating, fearsome, and the hardest puncher the world has ever seen. Before we move to the top 3, let's take a look at our honorable mentions. The boxers who contributed greatly during the decade. In this list is Aaron "The Hawk" Pryor. He was a two-time light welterweight world champion. He held the WBA and the ring light welterweight titles from 1980 to 1983, and the IBF and lineal titles from 1983 to 1985. Pryor was famous for his 2 wins over Alexis Arguello. He was named as the 1982 Boxing Writers of America Fighter of the Year. But his career suffered because of his drug abuse. He only fought 4 times from 1987 to 1990, suffering his first and only loss in 1987. Up next is Eusebio Pedroza. Nicknamed as El Alacrán, the Panamanian Pedroza was one of the greatest featherweights of all time. He held the WBA and lineal featherweight championship from 1978 to 1985. He defended his title 19 times, against 18 different opponents. However, after Pedroza loses the title in 1985, he only fought 5 times from 1986 to 1992, losing 2 of those fights. Up next is Thailand's Kasay Galaxy. He was known for the knockout power in his left hand, winning 41 of his 47 fights by knockout. Because of his punching power, he was called the Thai Tyson. He held the WBA super flyweight title from 1984 to 1991, making 19 successful defenses. Galaxy almost fought exclusively in his hometown Thailand, fighting only once outside of Asia. But overall, he was one of the greatest Asian boxers of all time. Up next is Wilfredo "Bazooka" Gomez. The knockout artist was one of the best Puerto Rican boxers of all time. The best of his career was in the 1970s, and although he suffered his 3 losses in this decade, he deserves a mention in this list, because he was a 3-division champion in the 1980s. He held the WBC and lineal super bantamweight title until 1982, the WBC featherweight title in 1984, and the WBA and lineal super featherweight titles from 1985 to 1986. Also in this list is Azuma Nelson. Nicknamed as the Professor, the boxer from Ghana was one of the greatest boxers from Africa. Nelson was a 2-division champion in the decade. He defeated Wilfredo Gomez in 1984 for the WBC featherweight title, holding the title until 1987. He reigned as the WBC Super Featherweight Champion from 1988 to 1994. Also in this list is Mike McCallum. Nicknamed as the Body Snatcher, the Jamaican legend was one of the best body punchers in the history. He was a two-division champion in the decade. McCallum held the WBA Super Welterweight title from 1984 to 1988, and the WBA Middleweight title from 1989 to 1991. McCallum defeated Julian Jackson and Donald Curry in the decade. Also in this list is the Korean great, Yoo Myung-woo. He was one of the greatest boxers that Korea has ever produced. He held the WBA Light Flyweight Championship from 1985 to 1991, making 17 successful defense, the light flyweight division record. He was considered as one of the greatest light flyweight champions of all time. Up next is another Korean great, Jung-Koo Chang. The Korean Hawk was one of the best boxers from Korea. He held the WBC Light Flyweight title from 1983 to 1988, making 16 successful title defenses. Chang holds a win over light flyweight great Hilario Zapata. He was considered as one of the greatest light flyweights of all time. Up next is Dwight Muhammad Qawi. The Camden Buzzsaw was an American two-division champion. Despite relatively small in his division, Qawi was one of the toughest fighters of the decade. He was the WBC and the Ring Light Heavyweight Champion from 1981 to 1983, and the WBA Cruiserweight Champion from 1985 to 1986. He holds wins over Matthew Saad Muhammad and Leon Spinks. Up next is the Lone Star Cobra, Donald Curry. The American boxer was a two-division champion in the decade. He won the WBA welterweight title in 1983, added the IBF title in 1984, the WBC and the ring titles in 1985, and reigned as the undisputed welterweight champion until 1986. He was the WBC light middleweight champion from 1988 to 1989. Up next is the Puerto Rican great, Edwin Chapo Rosario. He was a three-time lightweight world champion. He held the WBC title from 1983 to 1984, the WBA title from 1986 to 1987, and the WBA title, for the second time, from 1989 to 1990. He holds wins over Jose Luis Ramirez, Juan Nazario, and Livingstone Bramble. Rosario was one of the greatest boxers from Puerto Rico. Up next is Australia's bricktop, Jeff Fenech. He was one of the best boxers the Australia has ever produced. Fenech was a three-division champion. He won the IBF bantamweight title in 1985, in only his seventh professional fight. He reigned as the WBC Super Bantamweight Champion from 1987 to 1988, and as the WBC Featherweight Champion from 1988 to 1989. He holds wins over Daniel Zaragoza and Carlos Zarate. And last of the honorable mentions list, Carlos de Leon. The Puerto Rican was a four-time cruiserweight world champion. He held the WBC title from 1980 to 1982, the WBC for the second time, and the ring titles from 1983 to 1985, the WBC and the ring titles for the third time from 1986 to 1988, and the WBC title for the fourth time, from 1989 to 1990. De Leon was one of the greatest cruiserweight champion of all time. At number 3. Thomas, the Hitman Hearns. He was the second member of the Fab Four on this list. Hearns was the first boxer in history to win titles in 5 different divisions, winning the WBA welterweight title in 1980, the ring and WBC light middleweight titles in 1982, the WBC middleweight and the WBC light heavyweight titles in 1987, and the WBO super middleweight title in 1989. He holds wins over Roberto Duran and Wilfred Benitez. At number 2. Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Hagler was one of the best middleweights in boxing history, reigning as the undisputed middleweight champion from 1980 to 1987, making 12 successful defenses. He retired in boxing after his controversial loss to Sugar Ray Leonard. Hagler was the Fighter of the Year twice, in 1983 and 1985. He holds wins over Roberto Duran, John Mugabe, and Thomas Hearns. Hagler has one of the most durable chins in boxing and was one of the toughest boxers of all time. At number 1. The greatest boxer of the 1980s, Sugar Ray Leonard. Although Leonard suffered eye injuries in the decade, and he only has 12 fights, winning 10, with 1 draw and 1 loss. The quality of his opponents was a great one. He was the only member of the Fab Four to defeat all the other 3 boxers in that group. Leonard was a 5-division champion, the undisputed welterweight, the WBA, the ring, and lineal light middleweight, the WBC, the ring, and lineal middleweight, the WBC super middleweight, and the WBC light heavyweight titles. He was named as the 1980s Fighter of the Decade. Sugar Ray Leonard was one of the greatest boxers of all time. This is boxing. Boxing lives on. Continue to support this beautiful and exciting sport. Thank you for watching. For more boxing stories, boxing fights, and boxing news, subscribe on this channel. Click the notification bell for more updates. Because in this channel, together we will revive the boxing world.